The whale was desperately looking for help until he met a diver. Following him, he discovered something shocking. The huge whale was covered in thousands of parasites and was barely breathing. What did the diver do to change its fate? Subscribe so you don't miss new stories, and write in the comments where you're watching from. The morning air was crisp and still as the first light of day stretched across the coastline of British Columbia. The ocean lay in a vast, undisturbed expanse, its surface broken only by the occasional ripple of a gentle current. The sky, washed in hues of pale gold and lavender, cast a soft glow over the rocky shoreline, where sea lions basked on the sun-warmed stones. In the distance, the call of a gull echoed over the water, its lonely cry swallowed by the immensity of the sea. It was the kind of morning that promised a perfect dive. Clear visibility, steady waters, and a world of quiet wonder beneath the surface. Standing at the edge of his small boat, Elijah Carter adjusted the straps of his gear, taking one last deep breath before lowering his mask over his face. The familiarity of the routine was comforting. Over the years, he had performed these same movements countless times, each dive a new opportunity to witness the silent marvels of the ocean. But even after all this time, the moment before submersion still carried a thrill, a quiet exhilaration that tightened in his chest, a sense of stepping into the unknown. He checked his oxygen gauge, the pressure levels in his tank steady. The weight of his gear settled on his shoulders, a reassuring presence. His camera, encased in its waterproof housing, hung at his side, ready to capture whatever lay beneath. This was not just work for him. It was a lifelong passion, a calling that had taken him from the warm, silted waters of Louisiana, where he had grown up, to the icy depths of the Pacific Northwest. He had always felt an affinity for the ocean, a connection that ran deeper than mere curiosity. Elijah sat on the edge of the boat, glancing around once more at the vastness of the open water. Then, with a practiced motion, he tipped backward into the sea. The cold struck first, a sharp embrace that sent a shiver down his spine, even through the thick neoprene of his wetsuit. The silence followed, deep and absolute, broken only by the rhythmic sound of his own breathing through the regulator. The world above vanished, replaced by a shifting realm of blue and green, where sunlight filtered through the waves in golden shafts. Tiny air bubbles rose from his gear, spiraling upward like silver orbs, vanishing into the endless expanse above. He adjusted his buoyancy, allowing himself to sink deeper, his body becoming weightless as he drifted through the water. Below him, the ocean floor unfolded in a tapestry of color and texture. Kelp forests swayed gently with the current, their long, ribbon-like leaves stretching toward the light. Schools of fish darted through the fronds, their scales flashing like quicksilver as they moved in perfect synchronization. Starfish, in hues of deep purple and fiery orange, clung to the rocky outcrops, their arms stretching lazily across the seabed. It was a world in constant motion, yet peaceful, untouched by the hurried existence of the land above. Elijah moved slowly, letting the current guide him as he began to film, adjusting his lens to capture the intricate details of the marine life around him. The clarity of the water was exceptional today, 30 meters at least, allowing him an unhindered view of the depths that stretched beyond his immediate surroundings. Everything was as it should be. Then something changed. It was subtle at first, a shift in the water, a nearly imperceptible disturbance that sent a flicker of unease through his mind. The fish that had been moving so effortlessly a moment ago suddenly veered off in unison, disappearing into the kelp. A stillness followed, unnatural in its intensity. Elijah hovered in place, his fingers tightening around the grip of his camera. He had been diving long enough to recognize the signs. When the smaller creatures of the ocean fled, it often meant something larger was approaching. He turned his head slowly, scanning the area. A shadow moved in the periphery of his vision. It was distant, at the edge of visibility, a massive form gliding silently through the water. His first thought was a seal, perhaps even an orca. Both were common in these waters, but as the shape grew closer, its movements became distinct, measured, deliberate, almost hesitant. Then, from the haze of blue, a figure emerged, a young humpback whale. Elijah's breath caught for a moment as the creature drifted into clearer view. It was small, no more than 4 meters in length, its body sleek and dark, its white underbelly marked with the unique patterns that all humpbacks bore. It moved with a certain urgency, yet there was something hesitant in its approach, as if unsure of what it was supposed to do next. The young whale circled him once, slow and deliberate, its enormous eye fixing on him with an intelligence that sent a chill through Elijah's spine. He had encountered whales before, always at a respectful distance, always as passive observers to each other's existence. This was different. The calf swam closer, stopping mere meters away, its body tilting slightly to the side. Then, in a movement so deliberate it sent a shudder through Elijah's chest, the whale reached out, extending one of its pectoral fins just enough to brush the water near him before pulling back. It was as if it was trying to communicate. Elijah remained perfectly still, his fingers hovering over the record button on his camera. He had read stories about marine mammals displaying unusual behavior around humans, curiosity, playfulness, even recognition. But there was something in the way this calf moved, the way it lingered, that sent a deeper message. It needed something. The whale suddenly turned, swimming away in a swift arc only to stop and look back. It waited. Elijah exhaled slowly, watching the way it hovered in place, just beyond reach. Then it moved again, repeating the same action, darting forward, then stopping, watching, waiting, a silent call for him to follow. For a brief moment, his rational mind hesitated. Following a whale into open waters alone could be dangerous. He had no way of knowing where it intended to lead him, or for how long. But something in the calf's urgency struck him deep, in a way he couldn't ignore. He checked his oxygen levels again, made note of his direction, and, without allowing himself to second-guess the decision, kicked forward, following the young whale into the unknown. Elijah followed the young whale deeper into the open water, his movements controlled, deliberate. He had spent years exploring the ocean's depths, yet this moment was unlike anything he had ever experienced. There was a weight to it, a silent urgency in the way the calf swam ahead, stopping just long enough to glance back before moving forward again. It was leading him somewhere, and Elijah, despite the caution ringing in the back of his mind, knew he had no choice but to follow. The kelp forest gave way to a vast expanse of open sea, where the sunlight no longer danced in playful patterns on the ocean floor. Here, the water darkened, shifting to a deeper shade of blue, the abyss stretching endlessly below. The familiar comfort of the reef was gone, replaced by an unsettling emptiness. There were no fish, no darting silhouettes, no fluttering trails of tiny marine creatures. Just stillness. Elijah's breathing remained steady, the rhythmic sound of air through his regulator a constant reminder of his presence in this alien world. He checked his depth gauge. He was still within a safe range, but if the whale led him much farther, he would have to reconsider. The calf swam ahead, pausing only once more before veering sharply downward. Elijah hesitated, glancing at the dark void below. He had never been one to take unnecessary risks. Years of diving had taught him to respect the limits of both his equipment and his own endurance. He was alone out here, and even though the water was calm, the open sea was unpredictable. But the way the young whale hovered just out of reach, watching him, waiting, sent an undeniable message. It was pleading with him. He adjusted his buoyancy and followed. The descent was slow, controlled. The deeper they went, the more the light from above fractured, the surface growing more distant until it was little more than a shimmering haze. Then, finally, he saw it. A massive shadow loomed ahead, motionless, suspended in the water like a forgotten relic from another age. At first, it seemed unreal, a trick of the dimming light, a mirage created by his own anticipation. But, as he drew closer, the details sharpened, and a slow, sinking weight settled in his chest. It was an adult humpback whale. She was enormous, at least 14 meters long, her body nearly disappearing into the murky blue that surrounded them. But it wasn't just her sheer size that stole the breath from Elijah's lungs. It was the unnatural stillness, the eerie lack of movement in her massive frame. She wasn't swimming. She was simply hanging there, drifting, her long pectoral fins trailing motionlessly at her sides. Even from this distance, he could see the slow rise and fall of her rib cage, but it was strained, uneven. She was alive, but only just. The young whale, now hovering near her side, let out a low, sorrowful sound, the deep vibrations reverberating through the water. It wasn't just a call, it was a plea. Elijah moved closer, his heart hammering against his ribs. It was then that he saw what was truly wrong. The mother whale's body was covered in thick, crusted patches of parasites, barnacles, but not in the way he had ever seen before. Normally, humpback whales carried small clusters of these creatures, harmless hitchhikers that clung to their rough skin. But this was different. These barnacles had overtaken her. Her skin was encrusted with layer upon layer of them, their pale, jagged shells forming grotesque colonies that spread across her back, her fins, even along the ridges of her massive jaw. In some places, they were piled so thick that they resembled coral, dense and suffocating. Elijah had seen sick whales before, animals struggling with illness or injury, but this was something worse. This was the body of a creature that had been fighting for a long time, a creature that had been losing. He reached for his camera, but his hands were shaking. He had always believed in the power of documentation, in capturing the ocean's stories for the world to see. But right now, there was no audience, no documentary, no conservation project. There was only this whale, and her child, who had led him here, desperate for someone to help. Elijah hesitated only for a moment before securing his camera against his chest and reaching instead for the knife strapped to his thigh. It was a sturdy, well-worn tool, titanium, sharp enough to cut through thick kelp, designed for emergencies. He had used it before to free tangled marine animals from discarded fishing nets. But scraping barnacles off a living whale? That was something entirely different. He moved cautiously, aware that one wrong motion could startle the enormous creature. His fingers brushed the edge of her pectoral fin, and for a brief second, he thought she would react, flee, recoil, thrash, but she didn't. She barely moved at all. Carefully, he positioned the blade against the edge of the barnacle cluster nearest to him. He pressed forward, applying just enough force to begin prying it loose. The shell resisted at first, clinging stubbornly to the whale's thick hide, but then, with a sudden crack, it broke away. A fine trail of debris spiraled into the water as the parasite detached, revealing the raw, irritated skin beneath. Elijah exhaled, adjusting his grip before moving to the next cluster. The process was slow, painstaking. The barnacles were deeply embedded, their roots extending into the whale's flesh in places. Removing them wasn't just about scraping them off, it was about doing so carefully without causing further damage. He worked methodically, clearing away small sections at a time. The young whale remained nearby, circling restlessly, emitting occasional low-frequency calls that vibrated through Elijah's chest. It was the sound of concern. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, the rhythmic movement of his knife the only motion in the stillness of the deep. The mother whale's breathing remained slow, shallow, but there was something else now, a faint flicker of awareness. She wasn't completely gone. She was still fighting, but Elijah knew the truth. He could not do this alone. There were too many parasites, too much damage. He was only scratching the surface of what needed to be done. And worse, he was running out of air. His gauge showed that his supply was dwindling. He had minutes left, no more. With reluctance, he withdrew his hand from the whale's body, securing his knife as he prepared to ascend. The young whale immediately turned toward him as if sensing his intent. It followed him as he kicked upward, its movements frantic, distressed. Elijah surfaced, breaking through the water with a sharp inhale. The world above was too bright, too loud, too disconnected from what lay below. He reached for the radio in his boat, his fingers shaking as he tuned into the emergency frequency. "Marine Rescue, this is Elijah Carter, certified diver. I have an emergency." Static crackled, then a voice responded. "Go ahead, Carter. I have a humpback whale, adult female, critical condition, heavy barnacle infestation, possible secondary illness, location, approximately 1 mile northeast of Howe Sound." A pause, then urgency in the responder's voice. "Copy that, Carter. Can you confirm if she's still alive?" Elijah glanced back at the water, where the young whale still lingered near the surface, waiting. "Yes," he said, "but not for much longer." The responder's voice was steady. "Hold tight. We're dispatching a team. ETA 1 hour. Elijah clenched his jaw. 1 hour. He didn't know if the whale had that long, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't leaving her. The waiting was the worst part. Elijah sat in his boat, his wetsuit still dripping, his heart pounding with the steady urgency that came after an emergency call. The sky overhead remained the same pristine blue it had been when he first submerged, the sun hanging high, its reflection casting dancing ribbons of gold across the water's surface. But beneath him, in the quiet depths where time stretched endlessly, something far more fragile was clinging to life. He adjusted the frequency on his radio, listening for any updates from the rescue team. The estimated arrival time had been an hour, but time moved differently out here. It was impossible to tell whether that hour would stretch into eternity or vanish in the space of a single breath. Every moment that passed felt wasted, a cruel test of patience while the whale's life hung in the balance. The young whale still lingered nearby, its dark silhouette occasionally breaking the surface, releasing soft, hollow bursts of air that echoed in the silence. It wasn't leaving. If anything, it had grown more restless, circling the boat in slow, measured arcs. At times, it would stop, dipping its head beneath the water, watching him as if waiting for him to act. Elijah understood its anxiety all too well. His gaze drifted back to the spot where the mother whale remained submerged. She hadn't surfaced since he had left her. He checked the position of the sun, calculated the time. Too long. Even in her weakened state, She should have needed air by now. A cold weight settled in his chest. He couldn't wait any longer. Taking a deep breath, he secured his mask and regulator, rolled over the side of the boat, and slipped back into the water. The shock of the cold, though familiar now, still stole his breath for a second. He adjusted his buoyancy and let himself sink, kicking steadily downward toward the silent giant below. As the ocean swallowed him again, the world narrowed to the rhythmic sound of his breathing. Each inhale, each exhale, measured, controlled. He forced his mind to focus, to push aside the gnawing uncertainty. There was work to be done. The deeper he descended, the darker the water became. The surface light dimmed, shifting to a soft, eerie twilight where shapes blurred and distances warped. Then, finally, her massive form emerged from the gloom. She was still there. But something was wrong. She was drifting now, her body tilted slightly, her movements slower than before, barely perceptible. Even as he approached, she didn't react, didn't acknowledge his presence. The young whale, which had followed him back down, let out a low, haunting call, a sound that trembled through the water like a sorrowful echo. Elijah hesitated for only a second before moving closer. Up close, the barnacles seemed worse than before. Now that he was examining her in the muted shadows of the deep, he could see how completely they had overtaken her body. They weren't just parasites anymore. They were suffocating her, encrusting her flesh like an anchor dragging her into oblivion. She had been fighting for too long, and now she was losing. He reached out, pressing a gloved hand against her thick, scarred skin. No reaction, no sign that she even registered his touch. A new urgency ignited in his chest. He secured his knife, tightening his grip, and set to work. The first barnacle cracked free with more force than before, spiraling away in a trail of pale dust. He scraped another, then another, methodically removing what he could in the time he had. The process was slow, grueling. He had to be careful, had to balance between applying enough force to dislodge the parasites and ensuring he didn't wound her further. She was still alive, but only just. As he worked, the young whale remained nearby, circling, watching. Occasionally, it would swim closer, brushing against its mother in silent encouragement. Once, it turned its gaze toward Elijah, as if searching for reassurance. He wished he had any to give. Minutes passed, his arms ached, his oxygen was running low again. But he refused to stop, not yet. He had managed to clear a large section along her side, exposing raw, irritated skin beneath. The barnacles had sunk deep in some places, leaving small wounds where they had been, but at least she could move more freely now. At least she had a chance. Then, suddenly, the shift came. It was subtle at first, a flicker of movement, a shudder that traveled along her massive body like the first stirrings of a wakened giant. Elijah froze, knife still gripped in his hand. She moved. Not much, not quickly, but there was a response. A slow, shuddering exhale escaped from her blowhole, a thin stream of bubbles rushing upward, disappearing into the endless expanse above. Then, with effort, she stirred again, her massive tail twitching slightly, her pectoral fin lifting just an inch. Elijah's pulse surged. She was fighting, but she was still too weak. She needed help. His oxygen gauge flashed its warning, a reminder that his time was up. Reluctantly, he withdrew, kicking upward toward the surface. The young whale followed, its movements more frantic now, as if it understood what was happening. Elijah broke through the surface with a gasp, ripping his mask free as he climbed back into the boat. His lungs burned, his muscles ached, but his mind was already racing ahead, trying to figure out what came next. Then, on the horizon, a dark shape appeared. A boat. The rescue team had arrived. Relief crashed over him in a wave so strong it nearly stole his breath again. He reached for the radio, his fingers shaken with exhaustion. "This is Carter," he said, voice hoarse. "I've located her. She's still alive, but she's not going to last much longer." The response was immediate. "Copy that, Carter. We're moving in. Hold position." Elijah let the radio drop against his chest, his gaze shifting back to the water. The young whale was still there, watching him, its eyes, deep, knowing, filled with something ancient, held his for a long moment before it turned, dipping back beneath the waves. Elijah closed his eyes, inhaling the sharp, salty air. The fight wasn't over yet, but at least now he wasn't fighting alone. The rescue vessel cut through the water with quiet efficiency, its hull splitting the calm waves as it approached. The sound of the engine was low, measured, a deliberate attempt to avoid further distressing the struggling whale below. The team on board moved with the practiced coordination of those who had done this before, yet there was an unspoken weight in their movements, a shared understanding that every second mattered. Elijah steadied himself in his boat as the larger vessel slowed alongside him. A woman leaned over the railing, her expression sharp with focus. "Elijah Carter?" she called. "That's me." His voice was hoarse, thick with exhaustion. "I'm Dr. Adrienne Holt, lead veterinarian." She didn't waste time with introductions beyond that. "What's the situation?" Elijah took a steadying breath, pushing past the lingering tightness in his chest. "Adult, female humpback. Heavy parasite infestation. She's barely moving, barely breathing. I started removing the barnacles, but it's worse than I thought. She's weak. Too weak." He hesitated for a moment, then added, "Her calf led me to her." That last part seemed to give Holt pause, but only for a heartbeat. Then she nodded. "Understood." Turning to her team, she gestured toward the water. "We need a full assessment before we proceed. Divers, suit up. We're going in." Within minutes, 2 of the rescue divers were in the water, disappearing beneath the surface with slow, controlled movements. The remaining team members moved with efficient precision, preparing the necessary equipment. There were waterproof diagnostic tools, specialized scrapers designed to remove barnacles with minimal trauma, and medical kits containing everything from antibiotics to sedatives should they become necessary. Elijah exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. His limbs ached from fatigue, his muscles tight from exertion, but there was no part of him that considered stopping. He had brought them here. He wasn't about to step aside now. "Can I help?" Dr. Holt glanced at him, assessing. Her gaze flicked to his still-wet wetsuit, the knife strapped to his thigh, the set of his jaw. Then she nodded. "If you're up for it, get back in and assist the divers. We need to see just how bad it is before we decide on a course of action." That was all he needed. Without hesitation, he secured his mask and regulator once more, then slipped back into the water. The moment he descended, the familiar silence wrapped around him again, distant from the commotion above. But this time, he was not alone. The 2 rescue divers were already examining the whale, moving in careful, measured patterns along her body. Their flashlights cast long beams of white light against the dark water, illuminating the extent of the damage. It was worse than Elijah had realized. From this angle, with the added illumination, he could see just how deeply the parasites had embedded themselves. The barnacles had formed thick, jagged ridges along the whale's spine and flanks, their rough, calcified shells digging into her flesh. In some areas, the weight of them had caused the skin to split, revealing raw, inflamed tissue beneath. The wounds were infected, tinged with the cloudy white of necrosis. Elijah's stomach tightened. One of the divers turned, gesturing toward the radio strapped to his suit. Within seconds, Dr. Holt's voice crackled through the underwater comms. Assessment? A brief pause, then, severe infestation. Possible secondary infection. She's in critical condition. If we don't intervene, she won't last much longer. There was silence on the line for a moment before Dr. Holt's voice returned, steady but firm. Understood. Begin removal, slowly. We can't risk further injury. Keep me updated on her responses. The work began. Elijah and the divers moved in tandem, each assigned a different section of the whale's body. The tools they used were more advanced than his own knife. Specialized scrapers with curved edges designed to slip beneath the barnacles and dislodge them without cutting into the whale's skin. Even so, the process was painstaking. Each barnacle had to be pried free with care. The larger ones resisted, their bases buried deep into the whale's flesh, and removing them often revealed open sores beneath. The smallest ones were clustered in dense patches, requiring delicate maneuvering to ensure they were completely removed. Elijah focused on his task, blocking out the ache in his arms, the strain in his shoulders. He worked in careful, precise motions, dislodging the parasites one by one, watching as they tumbled away into the depths. The young whale hovered nearby the entire time. It never left. It circled them, slow and watchful, releasing low resonant calls every so often. Elijah didn't know if it was trying to communicate with them or with its mother, but the sound was haunting. An aching, desperate sort of song that rippled through the water like a quiet plea. Still no movement from the mother? One of the divers asked over the comms. Elijah glanced toward the massive whale, noting the sluggish rise and fall of her body. She was still alive, but barely. No movement, he confirmed. Keep going, came Dr. Holt's voice. They did. Minutes turned to an hour. The work was relentless, exhausting. They took turns, alternating between scraping and checking the whale's vitals. Slowly, the layers of barnacles began to disappear, revealing long stretches of dark gray skin beneath. Then, as Elijah worked to clear the last of a particularly dense patch near the whale's left fin, something changed. A shift. It was subtle at first, just the faintest tremor along her flank, barely perceptible. But then it happened again, a shudder running the length of her massive body. Her tail moved, not much, but enough to stir the water. She's responding, Elijah said, barely daring to hope. Confirmed, one of the divers added. She's trying to move. Above them, the radio crackled. Keep going, Dr. Holt instructed. Elijah turned back to his work, pushing through his fatigue. The whale was still weak, but this was a sign that there was something left in her, some final reserve of strength that she had not yet surrendered. When the last barnacle was removed from her left fin, Elijah withdrew, watching. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, so slowly it was almost imperceptible, she lifted her fin, just slightly, just enough. The young whale released a sound that was unmistakable now. Relief. Elijah felt something tighten in his throat, something that had nothing to do with the pressure of the water. She was still fighting, but they weren't done yet. He checked his oxygen. He had enough for one last push. Let's finish this, he said into the comms. And they did. The slow, deliberate movement of the whale's pectoral fin was all the confirmation Elijah needed. She was still in there, buried beneath exhaustion and pain, fighting to hold on. He had seen whales in distress before, creatures too far gone to respond, their bodies little more than empty vessels drifting toward an inevitable end. But this was different. This wasn't resignation. This was survival. Above them, the rescue team remained in constant communication, monitoring the situation from the surface. The divers below worked with renewed urgency, clearing away the last of the barnacle clusters, careful not to inflict further damage. The young whale continued to circle them, its presence a silent testament to the unbreakable bond between mother and calf. Elijah's arms burned with fatigue. Every motion, every scrape of the barnacle remover against the whale's thick skin felt heavier now. His oxygen gauge flashed a warning, a reminder that he was reaching his limit, but he ignored it. He had already surfaced twice to refill his tank, and each time the urgency of the situation had only grown. He wasn't leaving until the job was done. "We need to move forward with medical treatment." Dr. Holt's voice crackled through the comms. "We're sending down the first antibiotic injection. Stand by." One of the divers signaled, acknowledging the directive. A moment later, a long, pressurized syringe was lowered into the water, its protective casing designed to withstand the depth. It was meant to deliver a broad-spectrum antibiotic, something to fight the infection festering beneath the barnacle-infested wounds. The diver positioned himself near the whale's dorsal ridge, where the muscle was thick enough to absorb the injection without risk of further harm. The moment the needle made contact, the whale stirred. It was the strongest movement she had made yet, a slow, weighted shift of her entire body, as though she was trying to push against the force that had held her still for so long. A deep, sonorous vibration hummed through the water, traveling through Elijah's chest like a living pulse. The young whale, startled, released a higher-pitched call in response, swimming in tighter circles around them. "She's reacting," Elijah reported, gripping the scraper tighter. "Not aggressively, but she's aware." "That's a good sign," Dr. Holt responded. "Proceed with the second dose in 5 minutes." Elijah turned his attention back to the whale's tail, where the barnacle infestation had been at its worst. Now that the majority of them were gone, he could see the full extent of the damage. Deep indentations where the parasites had latched on for months, some of them still raw and irritated. The infection had already begun to take its toll, but without the additional weight of the barnacles, she at least had a fighting chance to regain mobility. "Second dose coming down," one of the divers confirmed. Elijah watched as another syringe was carefully maneuvered into position. This one contained an anti-inflammatory designed to reduce swelling and ease some of the whale's pain. It was a temporary measure, a necessary one, but ultimately what she needed most was time. Time to heal, to regain her strength, to recover from whatever had brought her to this state. The injection was administered without incident, but the whale responded again, this time with a slow, deliberate movement of her tail. It was weak, hesitant, but unmistakable. She was trying to swim. Elijah exchanged a look with the nearest diver, their eyes meeting through their masks. "She's coming back," he said, his voice thick with something that felt like hope. For the next 20 minutes, they remained in position, watching, waiting. The whale continued to show small but vital signs of awareness, twitching her fins, shifting her weight, responding to the calf's calls with low, throaty vibrations of her own. They weren't out of danger yet, but the tide was shifting. Then Dr. Holt's voice returned over the comms. "We need to prepare for transport. Carter, surface and stand by." Transport. Elijah hesitated, his grip tightening around his scraper. He had known this was a possibility, but hearing it confirmed sent a ripple of unease through him. Moving a whale of this size, especially one in such fragile condition, was a complex, high-risk operation. Still, there was no other option. He nodded once, signaling to the other divers before kicking upward toward the surface. As he broke through the water, he was immediately met with the sight of the rescue vessel repositioning itself. The deck was bustling with activity, ropes being secured, flotation pontoons being readied, equipment being prepped for deployment. Dr. Holt was waiting for him. "She's responding, but she's not strong enough to make the journey on her own," she said, getting straight to the point. "We need to get her to the rehabilitation center. It's the only chance she has." Elijah ran a hand over his face, the salt water stinging his eyes. He had seen the way the whale had moved beneath the surface, the way she had begun to fight against the weight that had been holding her down. It wasn't much, but it was something. "How do we do it?" he asked. Holt gestured toward the equipment on deck. "Inflatable pontoons. We secure them around her body, gradually increasing buoyancy to bring her closer to the surface. Once she's stable, we'll tow her with a slow-speed vessel toward the nearest protected cove. From there, we transfer her to a temporary rehabilitation enclosure." It was an ambitious plan, a dangerous one, but it was the only option. Elijah exhaled. "Let's do it." The team moved with swift precision, deploying the first set of flotation pontoons into the water. The divers, now reinforced with additional specialists from the boat, descended once more, maneuvering the massive, air-filled devices into position. It was a slow process, requiring meticulous adjustments to ensure that the whale's weight was evenly distributed. Elijah was back in the water, helping to secure the straps around the whale's midsection. The young whale remained close, weaving between the divers with nervous energy. It nudged against its mother's side, as if trying to encourage her to move. As the pontoons were inflated, the whale's body began to rise. It was a surreal sight. This massive, battered creature, long bound by her own weakness, now being lifted toward the light. She didn't fight it. For the first time since Elijah had found her, she seemed to surrender, not to death, but to the hands that were trying to save her. When she finally reached the surface, breaking through with a heavy, rattling breath, Elijah was there, watching. The calf surfaced alongside her, letting out a sound so raw, so filled with something ancient and instinctive that it sent a shiver through Elijah's spine. A call of relief, a call of hope. The work wasn't finished. The journey ahead would be long, uncertain, but for now, she was still here. And for now, that was enough. The rhythmic hum of the boat's engine droned softly against the backdrop of the open sea. The air was still, heavy with the scent of salt and the faint trace of diesel, but the waters remained mercifully calm, a blessing, given the delicate operation underway. Elijah stood near the bow, his hands gripping the cold metal railing, his eyes fixed on the massive form suspended just below the surface. The mother whale drifted between the inflated pontoons, her body buoyed by the careful engineering of the rescue team. She was no longer completely limp, but her movements were slow, hesitant, as though she had not yet reconciled herself with the possibility of freedom. The calf remained close, swimming anxiously in the shallow arc between her and the towing vessel, never straying far from his mother's side. "She's holding steady," one of the marine biologists called from the stern. "Breathing rate is still low, but it's consistent." Elijah exhaled, allowing himself to release the tension coiled in his chest. The worst was far from over, but they had passed the first hurdle. She was alive, and she was moving, barely, weakly, but it was enough for now. Dr. Holt approached, a clipboard tucked under one arm. The expression on her face was measured, analytical. She was assessing everything: the whale's condition, the speed of transport, the distance remaining to their destination. She stopped beside Elijah, her gaze still trained on the water. "She's going to need round-the-clock monitoring once we get her to the rehabilitation center," she said. "There's a lot we still don't know: extent of internal damage, long-term prognosis. But she's responding better than I expected." Elijah nodded, his mind still sifting through the weight of what they had just accomplished. "She fought," he murmured. "Even when she was barely hanging on, she still fought." Dr. Holt studied him for a moment, then turned back toward the water. "They always do." The hours stretched long as the slow-moving vessel pulled the massive whale toward shore. The process had to be handled carefully, with no sudden shifts, no unnecessary stress. The pontoons kept her partially afloat, reducing the strain on her exhausted muscles, but there was no telling how she would react once they reached the confines of the rehabilitation cove. Elijah remained by the railing, his body swaying gently with the movement of the boat. His mind replayed the moment he had first seen her, trapped beneath the weight of the barnacles, her body little more than a husk of what it had once been. He had seen too many stories like hers end before help could arrive, but this time, there had been a chance. The calf surfaced again, releasing a misty breath into the cooling air. The sound was soft, almost hesitant. Elijah's fingers tightened around the railing. He had no doubt the young whale understood exactly what was happening, and he had no doubt that if his mother had not been found, if she had slipped into that slow, irreversible descent, the calf would have stayed with her to the end. Even now, he wasn't leaving. By the time they reached the entrance to the cove, the sky had begun its descent into twilight, the horizon tinged with hues of deep purple and burnt orange. The water, smooth as glass, reflected the fading light in shifting streaks of gold. The land rose ahead of them, the rocky outcrops giving way to the protected enclosure built for cases just like this. A network of floating barriers stretched across the inlet, marking the boundaries of the rehabilitation space. It was large enough for the whale to move, to recover without the dangers of open water, but confined enough that the medical team could monitor her progress closely. The crew moved quickly, securing the entry point and preparing for the delicate process of guiding her inside. Elijah watched as the pontoons were slowly deflated, allowing her body to settle into the water under her own strength. For a long moment, she did not move. The ocean held its breath. Then a slow, shuddering motion rippled through her frame. Her pectoral fins stretched just slightly, her tail flicked in a weak but deliberate motion. The calf released a low resonant sound, encouragement, relief. And then, inch by inch, she moved forward. A collective exhale swept through the rescue team. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Elijah followed the crew as they disembarked onto the floating platform, watching as the massive whale adjusted to her new surroundings. The barriers would keep her safe from external threats, and the medical team would work tirelessly to stabilize her condition. It would take time. Weeks, maybe even months. But she had been given a chance. "She's in," one of the veterinarians called. "Vitals are holding steady." Dr. Holt gave a sharp nod. "We start the full assessment now. We'll need tissue samples, blood work, scans for internal damage." She turned to Elijah. "If you still want to help, we could use you." Elijah didn't hesitate. "Tell me what you need." The days blurred into each other. The first 72 hours were critical. The medical team worked in shifts, monitoring the whale's breathing patterns, her heart rate, her response to treatment. She remained weak, barely moving, but she was stable. The young whale never strayed far. He swam the perimeter of the enclosure, restless, vocal. Every so often, he would approach, nudging against his mother's side, coaxing her to move. Sometimes she responded. Other times she remained still. Elijah spent most of his time in the water, helping where he could. He documented the recovery process, ensuring that every step was recorded, not just for scientific analysis, but as a testament to the fight this whale had endured. It was on the fourth day that they confirmed what had been suspected from the beginning. She ingested something she wasn't supposed to, Dr. Holt told him, holding up the preliminary scan results. We found a foreign mass in her stomach. Fishing net, maybe plastic. It's causing an obstruction. Elijah felt the familiar anger rise in his chest. They had seen it before. Whales mistaking debris for food, swallowing toxic waste left behind by human hands. Some survived. Most didn't. "Can we get it out?" he asked. Dr. Holt nodded. "We're prepping for an endoscopic removal. If it's too large, we might have to surgically intervene. Either way, it needs to come out. Soon." Elijah exhaled, running a hand through his salt-stiffened hair. "She's been through hell," he murmured. Dr. Holt didn't argue. The procedure was delicate, requiring precision and absolute control. The veterinary team worked with careful hands, maneuvering the equipment to extract the tangled mess lodged in the whale's digestive tract. Elijah watched from the platform, tension coiling in his gut with every passing minute. It took hours, but in the end they pulled it free. A twisted, toxic fragment of human negligence. Elijah stared at it, the synthetic fibers glistening with seawater, the unmistakable scent of oil and decay clinging to its strands. "This," he said, voice quiet but firm, "is what almost killed her." Dr. Holt met his gaze. "And this," she said, nodding towards the recovering whale in the water, "is what saved her." Elijah looked back toward the enclosure, where the mother whale had begun to stir, her movements less strained now. The calf was beside her, close as ever. She had been given a second chance, and for now that was enough. The morning of the release came with a quiet stillness, the kind that settles over the ocean just before the tide shifts. The air was crisp, tinged with salt, the sky a vast canvas of soft pastels streaked with the first traces of dawn. The water inside the rehabilitation cove was calm, barely rippling against the floating barriers that had, for weeks, defined the boundaries of the mother whale's world. Elijah stood at the edge of the platform watching her. She was different now, stronger. Her movements no longer hesitant and strained, but fluid, purposeful. She no longer drifted as though she were at the mercy of the currents. She commanded the space around her as she was meant to. The young whale swam beside her, his presence as constant as ever. Throughout her recovery, he had never left her side, not even when the team had needed him to, not even when he had been urged away so they could conduct their examinations. He had watched everything, the injections, the tests, the long nights when she barely moved, and through it all, he had stayed. Elijah had been there for much of it, too. He had watched her fight through the worst of it, through the exhaustion and the weakness, through the long, uncertain hours when it had seemed as if she might never recover. He had watched as the toxins left her system, as the sores from the barnacle infestations began to heal, as the raw wounds on her side slowly faded into scars. Now she was whole again, and today she was going home. The rescue team moved efficiently, preparing for the final phase of the operation. The barriers at the far end of the cove would be opened, creating a passage back into the open sea. There were protocols in place, of course, precautionary measures in case she struggled, in case she hesitated. But the team had seen this before. If she was ready, she would know. Elijah shifted his weight, hands resting on his hips as he turned to Dr. Holt. She stood a few feet away, clipboard tucked under one arm, her gaze sharp and assessing. "You think she knows?" he asked. Dr. Holt glanced toward the whale, the corners of her mouth tilting into the faintest shadow of a smile. "Oh, she knows." They had monitored her closely over the past week, watching as her behavior changed, as her movements grew more restless. She had begun pressing against the barriers, circling the perimeter, testing the limits of the enclosure. It was instinct. She was meant to roam, meant to move beyond the confined safety of the cove. She was ready. The final checks were completed, the team giving their confirmations over the radio. The moment had arrived. Dr. Holt stepped forward, lifting the handheld transmitter to her lips. "All right, open the gate." A signal was given. A moment later, the floating barriers were detached, the structure shifting just enough to create a wide, unobstructed path leading toward the open ocean. The mother whale hesitated just for a moment. Elijah held his breath. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, she began to swim. She didn't rush. She didn't panic. She simply moved forward, as if she had always known this was how it would end. The young whale followed instantly, keeping pace with her, their movements synchronized. Together, they glided through the opening, their massive bodies passing through the final threshold of the enclosure. And just like that, they were free. Elijah exhaled, a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The ocean welcomed them, the vast, endless blue stretching out before them in quiet invitation. The calf surfaced first, releasing a misty breath of air into the morning light. Then, as if understanding the significance of this moment, the mother whale followed. She didn't just surface, she breached. Her massive body lifted almost entirely out of the water, arching through the air before crashing back down in an explosion of white spray. The sound reverberated through the air, echoing across the open water like a parting salute. Elijah had seen many whales breach before, but this was different. This was something else entirely. A moment of triumph, a moment of thanks. The team erupted into quiet cheers, subdued but filled with satisfaction. There was no need for anything loud, nothing to disrupt the sacredness of what had just happened. Elijah wiped a hand across his damp face, watching as the two whales swam farther into the open ocean. They didn't look back. They didn't need to. "They made it," he murmured. Dr. Holt nodded, crossing her arms over her chest. They did. There was nothing left to do now but watch them go. Elijah stood there for a long time, long after the others had begun packing up the equipment, long after the radio crackled with final reports. He watched until the dark silhouettes of the whales had become nothing more than shadows against the horizon, and then, finally, they were gone. He exhaled, feeling the weight of it all settle in his chest. The exhaustion, the relief, the quiet, overwhelming realization of what had just taken place. Not every story like this ended in success. He had seen too many that didn't. But this one had. And for now, that was enough. The weeks that followed the whale's release passed in a quiet blur, marked by a sense of finality that Elijah hadn't quite known how to process. Out at sea, things had a way of ending without ceremony. The ocean did not dwell on what had come before. It moved forward, relentless, indifferent, vast enough to swallow even the most extraordinary stories. And yet, this story had not disappeared. It followed him. Even after the rescue team had packed up their equipment, after the radio calls had ceased, after the reports had been finalized and sent to the appropriate conservation organizations, it lingered in his mind. It lingered in the way he caught himself glancing toward the horizon at odd moments, in the way he listened for the distant sound of a whale's breath breaking the surface. He had spent most of his life documenting the ocean's inhabitants, capturing their existence in crisp, high-definition frames so that others might understand the beauty, the fragility, the necessity of their survival. But this had been different. He had not just observed this time. He had intervened. He had fought for something, and in doing so, he had changed, not just the course of a single whale's life, but the trajectory of his own. The decision, when it finally came, felt less like a choice and more like an inevitability. He left his contract work behind. The glossy documentary projects, the tightly controlled production schedules, the detached narration of nature's struggles, they no longer felt right. He had spent years bearing witness to the slow unraveling of the ocean's ecosystems, filming the silent suffering of its creatures, but he no longer wanted to be a passive observer. He wanted to do something more. So he did. He joined the very rescue team that had answered his distress call that day in Howe Sound. It was a different kind of work. Harder, messier, less predictable. There were no scripts, no retakes, no perfect lighting setups. There were only real emergencies, real stakes, calls that came in at impossible hours, days spent battling exhaustion and the unforgiven elements. Some rescues that ended in victory, others that didn't. And yet, he had never felt more certain that he was exactly where he was meant to be. His hands, once so accustomed to holding a camera, now spent their days securing ropes, steadying sedation tools, cutting away nets and fishing lines tangled around the bodies of desperate, gasping creatures. His focus, once trained on composing the perfect shot, now zeroed in on survival, on the fine line between life and death that so many marine animals were forced to walk because of human negligence. And, in the midst of it all, he never forgot. He never forgot the mother whale, her body covered in suffocating parasites. He never forgot the young calf, waiting, pleading, refusing to leave. He never forgot the way they had disappeared into the open ocean, vanishing into the depths where they belonged. The world moved on, as it always did. The rescue became another report, another case study, a story passed between marine biologists and conservationists, a testament to the intelligence of whales and the power of intervention. But for Elijah, it was never just a story. It was proof. Proof that even in the face of overwhelming odds, survival was possible. Proof that the ocean was still worth fighting for. And so, every year, when the humpback migration brought them back to the waters of British Columbia, he went looking. Not because he expected to find them, not because he needed confirmation of their survival, but because the ocean had given him something that day, something he could not name but could feel in the marrow of his bones. A reminder, a promise, that life endured, that the tides always turned, that somewhere in the vast and endless blue a mother whale and her calf were still swimming, and that, for as long as he drew breath, he would be there to protect them. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Watch more videos to explore incredible ocean adventures and share this one with others who care about marine life. Every view, every share helps spread awareness,